In today's video, we're going to be diving into the individual factions that make up the Cities of Sigmar, and there are a lot of them, so I'm going to spread them out over the next, couple weeks or so we're not just focused on one battle tome for the next month, but it'll be interspersed with other content. But if you are a long-time follower of this channel, you'll know how badly I've wanted this and how excited I am for this lore, where we flesh out the humans and the mortals of the good guys and try and fill the world, tell us what their lives are like. To know more about these people that were shattered by the Age of Chaos and, of course, GW making them a billion little sub-factions and how they're all brought back together. And so today we're kicking off these lore videos with the most requested over the almost 4 years that I've been doing this channel, and that is about the Dispossessed. Now, if you are new to Age of Sigmar and you never played Warhammer Fantasy Battles back in the day, the Dispossessed are the dwarf factions from the old world. Their lore is highly reminiscent of that of think Tolkien dwarfs from Lord of the Rings and stuff like that. There are some differences, and Games Workshop definitely added new dimensions to it in Warhammer Fantasy Battles, but when you think of they live in very elaborate caves and mountains and things like that, and they like gold and money, it's very traditional, what we would call a dwarf. However, when these factions were brought forward into Age of Sigmar, they were given the title of Dispossessed, which literally means to be to deprive or be deprived of land or some kind of property. And honestly, that's all we had on them lore-wise for a long time. The Fyreslayers were introduced, which departed from that old world lore quite a bit, and then Kharadron Overlords, which was an even bigger move away from traditional, dwarf lore. And the Dispossessed were dwarfs, or now they call them Duardin, without a kind of a flavor of their own, not because they didn't have cool models or anything like that, but because they were just never really discussed. And that has changed a bit with the Cities of Sigmar book, and I think it does a great job of filling in that character, despite not having a lot of independent lore. None of the factions that we're going to talk about have a whole lot of independent lore. It's maybe a page, maybe two for some of them, but it does add a lot of color to that faction. So a quick recap on the history of the Duardin, right? The AOS name for dwarfs. In the Age of Myth, they were spread far and wide in every single realm, but they loved Chaman, the realm of metal, above all others. Some of these original Duardin desperately followed Grimnir, who's kind of the more fighty and, more honor-bound of the Duardin gods, the other one being Grugni, who's more about construction, engineering, technology, metallurgy, things like that. And even though they might have been pulled in different directions and then kind of leaned towards one deity or the other, they were on the whole a pretty healthy and unified race. Then the Age of Chaos came, and just like every other faction, this is kind of their true birth of their modern status, where we now know them as the Dispossessed kind of originated. Using the books of the Kharadron Overlord and the Fyreslayers, we can pretty kind of accurately tell what happened. Tzeentch poured into Chaman, realm of metal, and Khorne poured into Akshi, the realm of fire, Nurgle and Gairan. And their warbands rampaged through every realm, and they just kind of went everywhere, and everything fell apart for everybody. The Battle of the Burning Skies went terribly for the unified, just non-chaos armies, and everything that they had spent centuries building collapsed into pandemonium. Now, the numerous and sturdy Duardin keeps built deep into the mountains of the realms tried their best to hold back the tide of chaos, but the problem is these demonic legions and mortal warbands were just too numerous, and so one by one they began to fall. This unstoppable tide of evil pouring inside the gates of all these Duardin fortresses and keeps. And while I'm sure these battles were incredibly epic, the Duardin were being slowly wiped out. Now, at this point in the story, the species known as Duardin, they kind of take one of three paths, right? There's three responses to this catastrophe. The Fyreslayers dug deeper into their volcanic mountain ranges and began using the natural environment of molten rivers and jagged peaks and that kind of stuff as natural defenses, augmenting their own creations, right? Their own technological defenses, and basically they defended their homes and even sold out their services to both good and evil. Remember, if you want to know more about why they would work for someone who's evil or a Chaos faction, you can go check out the Fyreslayer Lore Week in the description down below. There's a link to that. But to put it really quickly, they're just doing anything they can to get Urgold to bring Grimnir back to life. So like they have their own prerogative when it comes to that. And largely that's why Chaos Forces, because it was inconvenient to fight them, but also they could just hire them, tended to leave the Fyreslayers alone. The second response was that of the Kharadron Overlord. This is all in Chaman, Realm of Metal. They had been developing flight technology using Aether Gold. So when the armies of Chaos came and basically rocked their deep mountain fortresses, they scrambled upward onto their ships, becoming these like refugees in the sky. And they basically ran away and missed most of the Age of Chaos. They were up there building these massive fortresses in the sky, away from the eyes of anyone else. Again, I'll leave a link down there to their playlist if you're interested in how that kind of went for them. But the third response was the topic of today's video. After the Battle of the Burning Skies, Sigmar knew this grand battle of Chaos's intrusion into the realms was simply not winnable. At least a war on this many fronts at this time was not winnable. And so he signaled the retreat and the call for everyone, get to Azyr, I'm closing the doors. And seeing how things were shaping up for their brethren, right, several Warden kings, who are the kind of the lords and the rulers of the Duardin holds, decided to abandon their homes and run into Azyr, which, for a society built on honor, pride, heritage, must have been incredibly hard. But this is an impossible situation, and given the choice between extinction or leaving, they chose to flee. Because remember, you gotta think about it from their perspective, right? Even though the Kharadron Overlords and the Fyreslayers survived, the remaining holds don't know that they survived, right? The Fyreslayers went deeper, probably cut off all communication, and the Kharadron Overlords went up to the sky and minded their own business. So like as far as the people in these isolated holds who are like kind of weighing their options, everyone's just dead but them. So to keep their kind alive, they ran into realm gates and headed to Azyr, and soon after that, the doors shut. Now, we talked about what happened then in this first video of this series, but for those just tuning in, Sigmar locked every realm gate leading to Azyr, but he had a problem. Chaos elements had already found a way in. And what followed was nothing short of terrifying. A purge the likes of which had never been seen, where a god of storms and lightning annihilated the corrupted government, and he culled his own population, wiping out anyone who was corrupted or even that he personally deemed might be corruptible. And this is where we're going to pause and think about this, right? Can you imagine sacrificing everything your people hold dear, right? Like the lands and the titles and all the honor and the heritage like that ran deep in these very traditionally focused Duardin or dwarves, right? You give up all of that. You lose all your possessions, but you keep telling yourself, it's okay. It's all so that we can survive. I know I'm making the right call, right? As a Warden King weighing your options. And then you arrive to what is supposed to be safety. The doors lock behind you. And then a god literally descends and pours murder and judgment out on everything around you. And maybe even some of your people. We know that Chaos Duardin exists. There's one in the Warcry warband set for the Iron Golems. And of course, obviously, the Legion of Asgore from Forge World. Insanity. This whole thing must have seemed like insanity. The Duardin that made it into Azyr named themselves the Dispossessed, having lost everything. Their homes, their possessions, and so much of their heritage, and also their bloodlines, their lineages, like their brothers and sisters are all being either killed by Sigmar because he deemed them as corruptible, or they just lost them on the way, or they were in another keep, something like that. But, as I followed up with in that video, the first one where we talked about that purge a little bit, things of course settle down and a new normal begins to exist. The Duardin didn't stay penniless refugees for very long. They were master engineers of weapons and armor, and they were smiths, experts at metallurgy and using the forge. And just as Sigmar began work on his project to take back the realms, which we know now is the Stormcast Eternal project, so too did the mortals collectively start building their culture for war, and they knew it was coming, and the Dispossessed had a major part to play in that. Now, as I said in that first video, plans and alliances were already being drawn the second the door was shut, for how the mortal forces of Azyr would work together, right? This is humans, elves, Duardin, to take back the realms, and it required the very best from all the races to achieve it. On the part of the Dispossessed, they bring two big elements to the table: knowledge on fortifications and weapons technology. So I'll break those down. So when it comes to fortifications, when an Azyr army moves into an area, the Dispossessed immediately start fortifying it. They're able to rapidly construct a defense network that they can stand the test of time and chaos hordes coming against it. The speed and efficiency of their building is what allows for the rapid expansion of Order armies, and also how you can see such crazy magnificent structures in the larger cities, like Hammerhall, for example. Likewise, this knowledge can be used on the offensive. Right, they can look at an enemy fortress after having scouted the area, assess the weakest point on the wall, and they can just ask, what's the smartest way to destroy our enemy? And that kind of thinking of understanding how defenses work, both to construct them and take them down, saves lives on the battlefield. And of course, what we really know about the Dispossessed is they are masters of weapons and armor. And that's been a long-standing part of Dwarf and Duardin tradition, right? Making incredible hammers and axes and magnificent sets of armor and a wide array of gunpowder and flame-spitting weapons. The units that represent this part of their what they bring to the table really in the Cities of Sigmar book are Warden Kings, Rune Lords, Longbeards, Iron Drakes, Iron Breakers, and Hammerers. But it's important to keep in mind that this is not all the Dispossessed, because these are just the units they send off to war, covered in elaborate plate metal and wielding devastating weapons. But there's many more that stay back in the city. These are smiths, traders, what we would call civil engineers, and council members to kind of rule the cities. But with all their prowess and their technology and all this stuff, they bring their might to bear on the battlefield, fulfilling oaths made with other Azyr forces long ago, demonstrating the power of their technology, but also their fortitude as a people. And at the same time, making the collective Cities of Sigmar stronger, smarter, well-armed, and well-armored. So, that is everything that the Dispossessed has. I pulled all of that between the one page in the Cities of Sigmar book that they got, and also the Kharadron Overlords and the Fyreslayers, of course. So why are the Dispossessed specifically really cool? I'm going to lay my cards on the table and say that before this book, I had almost no interest in the Dispossessed. But seeing their story and combining it with the other sources of the KO and the Fyreslayers, I have a new deep appreciation for them. Because we have three totally reasonable responses to a cataclysm. Right? The Fyreslayers dug in deep and became flexible with their morals, let's say, based on how much Urgold they could get. And the Kharadron Overlords used their tech to run away, cursing off the gods who never helped them. But that third option is the Dispossessed ran for refuge and started working with others. They became team players. And all three of these factions had to dramatically change to adapt to the Age of Chaos, right? None of them stayed the same, all being stretched in ways that pulled them from the traditional, what we would call dwarf from the old world, but now we call them Duardin, mold. Right, being a team player who abandons their home was never something the old world dwarfs would do. But facing extinction, the Dispossessed did, and I like that. I like that it's a logical change, but it still preserves the most core elements of the race. They still honor contracts, they still focus on technology and armor and weapons and engineering, and they value heritage and things like that. But like everything else, they had to change to meet a changing world. And while I do hope that they have their own book one day, I think they add so much to this faction lore-wise, and I'm happy that they're here for now. Being able to make reliable weapons and armor is, of course, obviously important when you're on this huge epic scale warfare against chaos. Rapidly making fortifications or an elaborate city for civilization to be born again in, the Cities of Sigmar just wouldn't be possible without the Dispossessed. And ultimately, that's what I wanted in this book. I wanted all these little sub-factions to find a place in this setting that I could get invested in. And with Dispossessed, I think they nailed it. We were clearly shown what they bring to the table, how they got there, and why other cities would really value them as a collective, right? Why all these different races have to work together and what they all offer each other as a whole. So friends, those are my thoughts on the Dispossessed with all the lore I could find and just kind of building off of it, some things that just really stuck out to me. Tell me your thoughts down below. Would you like them to one day maybe expand to have their own book? Do you like the direction they took them as kind of this third response to the Age of Chaos? Let me know in the comments down below. We'll continue the conversation there. Thank you all so much for watching, and happy wargaming.